Every time I talk about God, I'm talking about the Word. The Word, which is the truth. I'm talking about the Word that is the truth, that is the way life works. It's all God. God is so powerful until everything you see is being run by God. Everything you see happening, everything that has happened, and everything that's happening right now, every single thing that is taking place is all happening by the power of God's principles. God's principles are the most powerful thing you will ever come into contact with. And I know some people say, well, I don't like God. I don't believe in God. It don't matter. Even if you don't believe in God, God's principles is the most powerful thing you will ever come into contact with. And if you say, well, I'm not going to come into contact with God's principles, you see how ignorant you are? Because every one of us is in contact with God's principles right now. Every one of us are in contact with God's principles, whether we like it or not. It's the way everything works. If you do good, good is going to happen to you. If you do bad, bad is going to happen to you. If you think negative, negativity is going to come to pass in your life. If you think positive, positive things are going to manifest in your life. This is just the way it works. This is just how the principles of God work. Now, if you ask pretty much anybody, but especially church folks, if you ask the question, do you have faith? You are probably going to get the answer, yes. But one question that is hardly ever asked, or probably never asked, is what do you have faith in? What is your faith in? Because just making the statement that you have faith means nothing. Just claiming to have faith does not amount to anything. Sometimes I hear people talking about having faith. I just want to tell them to shut up. You have said absolutely nothing. What are you talking about? Faith in what? What is your faith in? Because you can talk to two different people and they can both claim to have faith. But the one that you will know has faith will be the one who is putting certain things into action. Don't tell me that you had faith in what God said, but you're not doing anything that God told you to do. Don't tell me that you really have faith that things are going to work out if you move forward, but then you don't move forward. It's not about you saying you have faith if your actions are saying you don't. But when we have faith, what we should have faith in is what God said. We should have faith in what God said in the Word, and we should have faith in what God says through his men and women of God. We should have faith in what God speaks through his true believers. If your faith is in what God said, then you will do what God says do in order to make what God said manifest. You hear a lot of people say, God is going to bless me. Wait a minute, you're lying, because God does not bless you unless you do ABC. You hear people say, well, I wasn't believing, but God showed up and, wait a minute, that's against the word. According to the word, if you are doubting God, you are not going to receive anything from the Lord. When we look in Scripture, Paul said he demonstrated the power of God for people so that their faith would stand in the power of God and not in the wisdom of men. That your faith stands not in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. We, true believers, have faith in the power of God. And if we have faith in the power of God, we have faith in the power of God's principles. God's principles do not fail, because God's principles cannot fail. It is not even possible for one of God's principles to fail. If you give, it will be given to you. If you show yourself friendly, you will have friends. If you seek, you shall find. If you knock, it shall be open to you. If you believe what you speak and speak things that you believe, you will have everything that you say. God's principles will never fail. God's principles will never fail. God's principles will never fail. But we see so many people who are living their lives basically alone, doing things their own way, when if they lived according to the principles of God, they would be in contact with different people who they need to be in contact with in order to get certain things done in your life. That's the power of God's principle. We see a lot of people who are living their lives broke, without the financial benefits that they need, because they are doing it their way, when if they would live by the power of God's principles, they would be givers and they would receive whatever they need in order to get things done. That's the power of God's principles. We see so many people who live their lives sick and hurting. But if they would just live by the principles of God, they could easily be healed and delivered. That's the power of God's principles. When you live by the power of God's principles, it makes life so easy. When you live by the power of God's principles, you have so much peace in your mind. The power of God's principles will keep you surrounded by the right friends. The power of God's principles will have money coming into your hands on a constant basis. The power of God's principles will have your body being healed before you even know that you're sick. The power of God's principles will get you your heart's desire without you having to slave and work your butt off in order to get it. The power of God's principles will have you paying off things before they said you should be able to pay it off. The power of God's principles will have your money multiplying faster than math says it should. The power of God's principles is against the wisdom of man. What man thinks he knows don't mean nothing when it's compared to the power of God's principles. I remember being in situations where man said you won't be able to buy a house for 6 years. But the power of God's principles got me in my house in 2.5 years. That's the power of God's principles. Man's wisdom says you accumulate wealth by investing in certain things and by getting all the money you can and canning all the money you get. But God's principles say give and it will be given to you. God's principles say if you give, men will give to you. That's the power of God's principles. But I know now we live at a time when nobody wants to do anything unless they Google it first. And if Google says do it like this, then that's what people do. They don't care what God says. They don't care what the pastor says. They don't care what somebody else who has already been successful says. They are going to do what Google says do, or they are going to do what man's wisdom tells them to do over anything else. And of course, that's their choice. Of course, that's your choice. But anytime you go with man's wisdom, you will always fail. And anytime you go with God, you will always be successful, because that's just the power of God's principles.